It's good to know what we are getting into, remarked Lady Cynthia, tossing the newspaper aside. But, honestly, they've made a complete mess of things. Her companion, Mr. Satterthwaite, glanced at her with curiosity. His name had appeared at the bottom of the guest list, and it was often said that if he was found at the home of some newly wealthy hosts, it meant one of two things: either the food was exceptional, or a real-life drama was about to unfold. Mr. Satterthwaite had an unusual fascination with the triumphs and downfalls of those around him. Lady Cynthia, a middle-aged woman with a sharp face and an ample amount of makeup, playfully tapped him with her stylish parasol, which rested at a jaunty angle across her lap. "Don't pretend you don't know what I mean," she said, narrowing her eyes. "You understand perfectly. In fact, I'd wager you're here just to watch the fireworks." Mr. Satterthwaite protested, shaking his head. He had no idea what she was talking about. "Oh, come now. I'm talking about Richard Scott. Don't tell me you've never heard of him." "Of course I have," he admitted. "Isn't he the big game hunter?" "That's the one, great big bears and tigers, oh my. As the song goes," she quipped. "Naturally, he's a huge sensation right now. The Uncatons must have been thrilled to get him here. And then, of course, there's the bride, such a lovely thing, truly charming. But so terribly naive. She's only 20, you know, and he must be at least 45. Mrs. Scott seems like an absolutely delightful woman," Mr. Satterthwaite remarked in his usual measured tone. "Yes, poor thing," sighed Lady Cynthia. "Why poor thing?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lady Cynthia shot him a knowing look but chose to approach the topic in her own way. "Porter seems decent enough, dreadfully dull, though. Another one of those sunburnt, silent types who spend too much time hunting in Africa. He's been playing second fiddle to Richard Scott for years, lifelong friends and all that. Now that I think about it, they were together on that trip, weren't they?" "Which trip?" "The trip? The Mrs. Staverton trip. Don't tell me you've never heard of Mrs. Staverton." Mr. Satterthwaite hesitated before replying, almost reluctantly, "I have heard of her." Their eyes met in mutual understanding. "Honestly, it's so typical of the Uncatons," Lady Cynthia groaned. "They are completely hopeless, socially, I mean. Inviting those two together. They probably just thought, oh, Mrs. Staverton is a well-known explorer, a real adventurer, and she wrote that book. People like the Uncatons don't even begin to understand how disastrous their guest lists can be. I've spent the past year guiding them through these pitfalls, and let me tell you, it's been exhausting. Constantly having to whisper, no, don't do that. You simply can't invite them together. Well, I'm through with it now. Not that we had a falling out, oh no, I never stooped to that, but someone else can deal with them. As I always say, I can tolerate vulgarity, but I will not abide stinginess." She paused for dramatic effect, reflecting on the many ways in which the Uncatons had personally offended her sensibilities. "If I were still managing their affairs," she continued, "I would have put my foot down and said outright, you simply cannot invite Mrs. Staverton if the Scotts are coming. Because she and Richard Scott were once," she stopped herself deliberately. "Were they?" Mr. Satterthwaite asked, his voice mild. "My dear man, it's common knowledge. That expedition into the interior. Frankly, I'm astonished she had the nerve to accept the invitation." "Perhaps she didn't realize they would be here as well," he suggested. "Or perhaps she did," Lady Cynthia said meaningfully. "Far more likely, don't you think? She's what I'd call a dangerous woman, the kind who stops at nothing. If I were Richard Scott, I wouldn't be too comfortable this weekend. And his wife? She has no idea." "None whatsoever," Lady Cynthia said confidently. "But I imagine some helpful soul will enlighten her soon enough." She suddenly brightened. "Oh, here comes Jimmy Allinson, such a nice boy. He saved my life in Egypt last winter. I was simply dying of boredom. Jimmy, over here." Captain Allinson, a handsome man of 30 with a boyish grin, strolled over and dropped onto the grass beside her. "I'm glad someone wants my company," he said, flashing a smile. "The Scotts are off playing lovebirds, strictly a duet, not a trio. Porter's buried in the field, and I was dangerously close to being entertained by our hostess." He chuckled. Lady Cynthia laughed with him. Mr. Satterthwaite, who had rather old-fashioned manners and did not believe in mocking one's hosts until safely away from their home, remained silent. Poor Jimmy, Lady Cynthia sighed. Mine not to reason why, mine but to swiftly fly. I barely escaped being subjected to the family ghost story. An Unkatun ghost? Jimmy asked, grinning. Not an Unkatun ghost, Mr. Satterthwaite corrected. A Greenways ghost. They acquired it along with the house. Ah yes, Lady Cynthia mused. Now I remember. But it doesn't rattle chains, does it? Something to do with a window, I believe. Jimmy Allinson looked up sharply. A window? But before anyone could answer, Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze shifted beyond Jimmy, toward three figures walking toward them from the house. A slender young woman walked between two tall, dark-haired men. At first glance, the men seemed alike, both sun-bronzed and sharp-eyed, but a closer look revealed stark differences. Richard Scott, the famed hunter and explorer, radiated energy, his presence commanding attention effortlessly. John Porter, his longtime companion, was more reserved, squarely built, with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. He had always been content to remain in Scott's shadow. And between them walked Moira Scott, until recently Moira O'Connell. She was delicate, almost ethereal, with wide brown eyes and golden red hair that framed her face like a halo. Lady Cynthia laughed with him. Mr. Satterthwaite, who had rather old-fashioned manners and did not believe in mocking one's hosts until safely away from their home, remained silent. Poor Jimmy, Lady Cynthia sighed. Mine not to reason why, mine but to swiftly fly. I barely escaped being subjected to the family ghost story. An Unkatun ghost? Jimmy asked, grinning. Not an Unkatun ghost, Mr. Satterthwaite corrected. A Greenways ghost. They acquired it along with the house. Ah yes, Lady Cynthia mused. Now I remember. But it doesn't rattle chains, does it? Something to do with a window, I believe. Jimmy Allinson looked up sharply. A window? But before anyone could answer, Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze shifted beyond Jimmy, toward three figures walking toward them from the house. A slender young woman walked between two tall, dark-haired men. At first glance, the men seemed alike, both sun-bronzed and sharp-eyed, but a closer look revealed stark differences. Richard Scott, the famed hunter and explorer, radiated energy, his presence commanding attention effortlessly. John Porter, his longtime companion, was more reserved, squarely built, with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. He had always been content to remain in Scott's shadow. And between them walked Moira Scott, until recently Moira O'Connell. She was delicate, almost ethereal, with wide brown eyes and golden red hair that framed her face like a halo. That girl mustn't be hurt, Mr. Satterthwaite thought grimly. It would be a terrible thing if someone like her were to suffer. Lady Cynthia waved her parasol in greeting. Sit down and don't interrupt, she commanded playfully. Mr. Satterthwaite is about to tell us a ghost story. I love ghost stories, Moira said eagerly, settling herself on the grass. The ghost of Greenway's house? Richard Scott asked. Yes, Mr. Satterthwaite murmured, his gaze lingering on the three of them. You've heard about it? Scott nodded. Yeah, I used to stay here back in the day, he explained. Before the Elliots had to sell the place. The Watching Cavalier, right? The Watching Cavalier, his wife repeated softly. That has a nice ring to it. Sounds intriguing. Please, go on. Mr. Satterthwaite hesitated, shifting in his seat. Honestly, there's not much to tell. It's really not that interesting. Now you've done it, Satterthwaite, Richard Scott teased. That little hint of hesitation just made it irresistible. The group, now clearly curious, waited for him to continue. With a sigh, Mr. Satterthwaite gave in. All right, but it's just an old story. Supposedly, an ancestor of the Elliot family, a cavalier, was betrayed by his wife, who had fallen in love with a Roundhead. The lover killed the cavalier in an upstairs room, and as the guilty pair fled, they looked back to see the dead man's face staring at them from the window. He paused. The ghost story part is about that window. There's a stain on one of the panes, barely visible up close, but from a distance, it looks eerily like a man's face watching from inside. Which window is it? Asked Mrs. Scott, peering at the house. You can't see it from here, Mr. Satterthwaite replied. It's on the other side. They boarded it up from the inside years ago, 40, if I remember correctly. But why board it up if the ghost doesn't actually appear? Superstition, I suppose, he admitted. Some people just didn't like the idea of it. He smoothly changed the subject, leading the conversation toward Egyptians and diviners. Frauds, most of them, Jimmy Allinson declared. Good at telling you vague things about your past, but they won't risk predicting the future. I thought it was usually the other way around, John Porter remarked. It's illegal to tell the future in this country, isn't it? Richard Scott added. Moira once got a gypsy to read her fortune. The woman took one look at her palm, gave her money back, and refused to say anything. Maybe she saw something awful and didn't want to tell me, Moira said with a nervous laugh. Don't be dramatic, Moira, Allinson said lightly. I refuse to believe that some dark fate is hanging over you. Mr. Satterthwaite, however, wasn't so sure. He watched as two women approached from the house, a short, round woman dressed in jade green and a taller, elegant figure in creamy white. The first was their hostess, Mrs. Unkatun, the second, a woman he had heard much about but never met. Here's Mrs. Stavridon, Mrs. Unkatun announced, clearly pleased. I think we are all friends here. These people have an uncanny way of saying exactly the wrong thing, murmured Lady Cynthia, but Mr. Satterthwaite wasn't listening. His eyes were on Mrs. Stavridon. She moved with ease, naturally becoming the center of attention. Hello, Richard. Ages since we last met. Sorry I missed the wedding. She turned to Moira with a warm smile. So you're his wife. You must be getting tired of meeting all his old friends. Moira responded politely, though a little shyly. Mrs. Stavridon's gaze lingered just a moment longer before she shifted effortlessly to another familiar face. John. Her tone was the same, but something in it softened, a warmth not present before. And then, that smile. It changed everything. Lady Cynthia had been right. She was dangerous. Later that evening, Mr. Satterthwaite and Major Porter took a stroll across the lawn. Very interesting story you told earlier, the Major commented. I can show you the window if you like, Satterthwaite offered. He led the way to the west side of the house, where a small, enclosed garden lay hidden behind towering holly hedges. This is the privy garden. Very private, as the name suggests. They walked through the old-fashioned garden, reaching a spot where they could see the house's west wall. Only one window was visible on the first floor, nearly swallowed by ivy, its glass dark and grimy. A faint stain marred one pane, just noticeable in the dim light. Porter squinted. I see some discoloration, but nothing more. We are too close. There's a clearing in the woods where you get a proper view. As they made their way through the trees, Satterthwaite explained, they had to add another window when they boarded this one up. The new one faces south. I believe the Scots have that room now. He hesitated. That's why I didn't want to bring it up earlier. Moira might feel uneasy knowing they are in what some call the haunted room. Porter, however, barely seemed to hear. She shouldn't have come, he muttered. Satterthwaite raised an eyebrow. You mean Mrs. Stavridon? Porter didn't answer at first. Then, abruptly, he said, Scott, Iris, and we travelled together once. She's an extraordinary woman. A damn fine shot. He paused, frowning. Why did they invite her? Ignorance, perhaps. Porter shook his head. There's going to be trouble. They stepped onto a grassy hill overlooking the house. The window stood out against the darkening sky. And there, pressed against the pane, was the unmistakable shape of a man's face, crowned with a plumed cavalier's hat. Later that evening, Mr. Satterthwaite and Major Porter took a stroll across the lawn. Very interesting story you told earlier, the Major commented. I can show you the window if you like, Satterthwaite offered. He led the way to the west side of the house, where a small, enclosed garden lay hidden behind towering holly hedges. This is the privy garden. Very private, as the name suggests. They walked through the old-fashioned garden, reaching a spot where they could see the house's west wall. Only one window was visible on the first floor, nearly swallowed by ivy, its glass dark and grimy. A faint stain marred one pane, just noticeable in the dim light. Porter squinted. I see some discoloration, but nothing more. We are too close. There's a clearing in the woods where you get a proper view. As they made their way through the trees, Satterthwaite explained they had to add another window when they boarded this one up. The new one faces south. I believe the Scots have that room now. He hesitated. That's why I didn't want to bring it up earlier. Moira might feel uneasy knowing they are in what some call the haunted room. Porter, however, barely seemed to hear. She shouldn't have come, he muttered. Satterthwaite raised an eyebrow. You mean Mrs. Stavardin? Porter didn't answer at first. Then, abruptly, he said, Scott, Iris and we travelled together once. She's an extraordinary woman. A damn fine shot. He paused, frowning. Why did they invite her? Ignorance, perhaps. Porter shook his head. There's going to be trouble. They stepped onto a grassy hill overlooking the house. The window stood out against the darkening sky. And there, pressed against the pane, was the unmistakable shape of a man's face, crowned with a plumed cavalier's hat. What happens when the glass finally breaks? Porter mused. Satterthwaite smiled. That's the strange part. The glass has been replaced at least 11 times. Yet, each time, the stain returns gradually, over a few months. Porter shuddered. Damn odd, that. As they returned to the house, voices carried from the privy garden. You'll regret this. Iris Stavardin's voice rang out. Jealousy, it's the devil, Richard. Be careful. She stormed past them, walking swiftly as if pursued by something unseen. Later that night, Mrs. Unkerton confided to Satterthwaite, I've called the glazier to replace that window. I don't like it. You know the stain will return, he said. That's as it may be, she replied. But I won't have that horrible story attached to my house. Satterthwaite didn't argue. He had seen too many things crumble before money. But something told him the real problem had nothing to do with a ghost. Something much more dangerous was unfolding. And as he climbed the stairs to bed, he thought, I wonder what's going to come of all this. He fell silent for a moment, his gaze fixed, not on the house, but on the dense thicket that enclosed them. Then, almost absently, he murmured, You ever think civilization is a dangerous thing? Dangerous? Mr. Satterthwaite was taken aback. Such a radical notion unsettled him deeply. Porter gave a brief, almost humorless laugh. No release valve, he said. Then, without another word, he turned and started back down the path. Mr. Satterthwaite, hurrying to keep up, pressed on. I don't quite follow. Reasonable people. Porter cut him off with another short laugh, this one sharper. You think I'm talking nonsense, don't you? He glanced at the older gentleman beside him. But there are people who can sense a storm before it hits. Feel it in the air. And there are others who know when trouble's coming. He stopped suddenly and grabbed Satterthwaite's arm, his whole body tense. The night held its breath. Then it came. 2 sharp cracks. A woman's scream followed. My God, Porter breathed. It's happening. In an instant, he was sprinting down the path. Satterthwaite struggled to keep up, his breath coming in quick gasps. When they reached the lawn, just beyond the hedge bordering the privy garden, 2 figures appeared from the opposite side, Richard Scott and Mr. Unkerton. They stopped abruptly, staring at each other across the entrance. It came from inside, Unkerton stammered, his hand trembling as he pointed. We have to see, Porter said, striding ahead. As they rounded the last bend of the holly hedge, he stopped dead. Mr. Satterthwaite, peering past his shoulder, felt the breath leave his body. Richard Scott let out a choked cry. 3 figures were inside the privy garden. 2 lay sprawled on the grass near the stone bench, a man and a woman. The third, standing rigid with wide, horror-stricken eyes, was Mrs. Stavardin. In her hand, she clutched something small and dark. Iris, Porter called, his voice tight. Iris, for God's sake, what is that in your hand? She looked down at it, as if noticing it for the first time. There was a strange detachment in her voice when she spoke. It's a pistol, she said softly. Then, after a beat, she added, I picked it up. Meanwhile, Satterthwaite had hurried over to where Unkerton and Scott had knelt beside the fallen bodies. A doctor, Scott muttered hoarsely. We need a doctor. But it was too late for that. Jimmy Allinson, who had scoffed at fortune-tellers, and Moira Scott, whose shilling had been returned by the gypsy, lay in the final, eternal stillness. Richard Scott, his face taut with grief, examined his wife's still form. His voice was measured, but strained. Shot from behind. The bullet went straight through. He turned to Jimmy Allinson, checked the wound. This one's in the chest. Bullets still lodged inside. Porter stepped forward, his expression grim. Nothing should be disturbed, he said firmly. The police must see everything exactly as it is. Scott's eyes burned as he looked toward the woman standing motionless by the hedge. He took a step toward her, but Porter subtly shifted, blocking his path. For a moment, a silent battle of wills played out between them. Then Porter shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "No, Richard," he said. "I know how it looks, but you're wrong." Scott's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Then why is she holding that gun?" Again, in the same distant, almost dreamlike voice, Iris Stavridon replied, "I picked it up." Uncle Tun found his voice. "The police," he said urgently. "We must send for the police at once. Scott, will you telephone? Someone should remain here." "Yes, I think someone should stay." Mr. Satterthwaite, ever the gentleman, offered to do so, and Uncle Tun gratefully accepted. "The ladies," he said vaguely. "I must inform my wife. And Lady Cynthia." As the others hurried away, Satterthwaite lingered, looking down at Moira Scott. "Poor child," he murmured. "Poor child." He recalled the old saying about the evil that men do living after them. And he wondered, was Richard Scott, in some way, responsible for his wife's death? And if so, was Iris Stavridon truly to blame, or was she just another casualty of the unseen forces at play? His gaze rested on Moira's face, so pale, so delicate. A half-smile lingered on her lips, her golden hair tousled. A small speck of blood marked her earlobe. An earring, torn away as she fell. Yes, there it was, the twin pearl still dangling from her other ear. A quiet voice broke the silence. "And now, sir," said Inspector Wingfield. They had moved to the library. The inspector, a sharp-eyed, authoritative man, had taken charge. He had interviewed most of the guests and, by all appearances, had already made up his mind. "So, as I understand it," he began, "you gentlemen were returning from a walk, using the path that runs along the left side of the Privy Garden." "Correct." "Yes, Inspector," Porter confirmed. "You heard 2 shots and a woman scream." "Yes." "You ran to the garden entrance. If anyone had left through it, they would have had to pass one of you or Mr. Uncle Tun. The holly bushes are too thick to get through anywhere else." "Correct." "That's right," Porter said, his face pale. "Then that settles it," the inspector concluded. Everyone else was accounted for at the time. Mrs. Stavridon was seen walking toward the Privy Garden just minutes before the shots were fired. She was found inside, holding the murder weapon. And we know she had motive. Porter tensed. "That's a damn lie." The inspector merely shook his head. "What does she have to say for herself?" Satterthwaite asked. "She claims she entered the Privy Garden just after hearing the shots. She found the gun on the ground and picked it up. Says she saw no one else there." A pause. "That's her story. And despite my cautioning, she insisted on making that statement." Porter turned desperately to Satterthwaite. Can't you do something?" Before Satterthwaite could respond, the butler entered, carrying a small card on a tray. "A gentleman insists on seeing you, sir. He says he has an appointment." Uncle Tun barely glanced at the card. "Harley Quinn. Oh yes, something about a painting. But now isn't." Satterthwaite's reaction was immediate. "Harley Quinn. Here?" Something flickered in his expression. Excitement. Relief. "Porter," he said gravely, "you asked if I could help. I think I can. This man, he has a way of making you see things differently. Let him hear the case." Uncle Tun hesitated, then nodded to the butler. A tall, slender man stepped into the room. "Mr. Satterthwaite," he greeted with a knowing smile. Still drawn to the drama. Her hair was disheveled, and a small smear of blood marked her delicate ear. The moment he spoke the words, he realized their weight. It was a detail too significant to ignore. Blood on her ear. Uncle Tun repeated slowly. Yes. I remember now. It must have happened when her earring was torn out during the fall, Mr. Satterthwaite suggested. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. Something about it felt off. She was lying on her left side, Porter noted. So it must have been her left ear. No, Mr. Satterthwaite's response was swift, almost too quick. It was her right ear. The inspector cleared his throat and reached into his pocket. I found this in the grass. He held up a twisted loop of gold wire. Porter's face darkened. That couldn't have been ripped apart just from a fall. That earring looks like it was. He hesitated before finishing the thought. Blasted off by a bullet. Mr. Satterthwaite inhaled sharply. That's it. It had to be a bullet. It makes perfect sense. The inspector shook his head. There were only 2 gunshots. A single bullet couldn't have grazed her ear and hit her in the back as well. And if one shot knocked off the earring, the second would have had to kill her. But that would mean, he trailed off, eyes widening. It would mean Captain Allinson wasn't just nearby. He was standing right in front of her. Mr. Quinn's voice was soft, yet it carried through the room like a ripple in still water. He smiled slightly. Or perhaps, holding her in his arms. A heavy silence fell over the group. The suggestion was startling, almost absurd. Uncle Tun found his voice first. But they barely knew each other. Mr. Satterthwaite stuttered the floor, lost in thought. Or maybe they knew each other better than we assumed. Lady Cynthia mentioned he kept her entertained in Egypt last winter. And Porter, he turned toward him, you told me Richard Scott met his wife in Cairo last winter. It's possible, very possible, that they had a history. Uncle Tun frowned. But they weren't exactly close here. If anything, they seemed to avoid each other. Yes, Mr. Satterthwaite agreed. So much so that, now that I think about it, it was almost unnatural. All eyes turned toward Mr. Quinn. There was something unsettling about the way he observed them, as if he had already put the pieces together long ago. He stood up. You see, he said lightly, Mr. Satterthwaite's intuition has led us somewhere interesting. Then he fixed his gaze on Uncle Tun. Now it's your turn. Uncle Tun blinked. Oh. I don't follow. You seemed deep in thought when I arrived, Quinn continued. Tell us what was on your mind. Even if it seems unrelated. Even if it feels foolish. Uncle Tun hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. It's ridiculous, he admitted. But I was just thinking that maybe my wife should have left that broken pane of glass in the haunted window alone. I can't shake the feeling that replacing it brought some kind of curse. His words seemed to land harder than expected. Porter and Satterthwaite exchanged a glance. But it hasn't been replaced yet, Satterthwaite said slowly. Yes, it has, Uncle Tun insisted. The workman came first thing this morning. Porter stiffened. My God, he murmured. I think I understand now. His gaze snapped to Uncle Tun. That room, it's panelled, isn't it? Not wallpapered. Yes, but... Porter didn't wait for an answer. He turned and strode out of the room with purpose. The others rushed after him as he headed straight upstairs to the Scots' bedroom. It was a charming room, with soft cream paneling and 2 sunlit windows facing south. Porter ran his hands along the western wall, pressing carefully. There's got to be a latch somewhere. Ah. A faint click echoed through the room and a section of the paneling slid open, revealing the grimy panes of the so-called haunted window. One pane of glass stood out, clean, new, untouched by time. Porter bent down and plucked something from the floor. He held it up, a tiny fragment of an ostrich feather. Then he turned to Mr. Quinn, who simply nodded. Without hesitation, Quinn crossed the room to the hat cupboard and pulled out an elegant, wide-brimmed hat adorned with curling feathers. A hat fit for Ascot. Quinn's voice was soft, almost distant, as he spoke. Imagine a man, he said, consumed by jealousy. A man who, long ago, discovered the secret hidden within these walls. Perhaps, out of curiosity, he opened the panel one day and saw something he wasn't meant to see. He glanced toward the window. From here, he would have looked down upon the privy garden. And there, believing themselves unseen, were his wife and another man. A pause. A slow breath. There could be no doubt in his mind. Their closeness, their laughter, it all confirmed his worst fears. Blinded by rage, he sought revenge. Quinn lifted the hat. And then, an idea struck him. He put on this. A hat with a wide brim and soft, curling feathers. The light was dim, and he knew the legend of the watching cavalier. Anyone who looked up would see only a shadow, a shape in the window. A trick of the mind. Quinn's fingers trailed along the brim of the hat. He waited. And when the moment came, when they were locked in an embrace, he fired. No one spoke. No one breathed. The first bullet struck true. They fell. He fired again, perhaps out of fury, or simply to make sure. The second shot tore away the earring. Quinn looked up, meeting Porter's gaze. Then, he discarded the gun into the garden, rushed downstairs, and slipped out through the billiard room. Porter took a step forward, his voice raw. But he let her be accused. He let her take the blame. Why? Quinn's expression was unreadable. I have a theory, he said. Just a theory, mind you. But I believe Richard Scott was once madly in love with Iris Staverton. So much so that, even years later, the thought of her with another man still burned inside him. Porter swallowed hard. And she? Did she love him? I think, once upon a time, she thought she might. Quinn's voice was quiet now. Perhaps she went on a hunting trip with him and another. And perhaps, when she returned, she realized she had fallen for the better man. Porter barely whispered the words. The better man. Quinn smiled, the faintest, knowing smile. Yes, he said. I mean you. For a moment, the room held nothing but silence. Then Quinn's voice softened. If I were you, he said, I'd go to her now. Porter didn't hesitate. He turned and walked out.